Hello all, this is the Owl, and today, hell yes, I have been waiting for this. We're going to be finishing out Satougashi. If you haven't watched part 1, I would strongly recommend doing that. It's linked in the description. Oh, and before we get going, one very quick thing. As some people have politely pointed out to me in the previous video, there is in fact a qualitative difference between shoujo ai and yuri, even though these two things are frequently used synonymously these days. Strictly speaking, yuri implies some sort of physical relationship that shoujo ai does not necessarily involve. So yes, this story is indeed probably more appropriately classified as shoujo ai. Okay? Anyways, Volume 2 is where the story begins to get messy, and we start to get answers to the various mysteries set up in Part 1. However, as with last time, please be warned, while more detailed trigger warnings would give away a lot of the twists and turns coming, this is where the story gets really dark, and that constant sense of menace and tension begin to pay off. And I won't lie, the ending of this bloody thing is going to stay with you for a long time. You have been warned. This is a very good manga, and one of the things that I like most about it is that it's rather challenging. I like it when good and bad aren't perfectly laid out, and events or even an entire character, yes, hello comment section, are not fully explained, and we are left to draw our own conclusions or pass our own judgments. There are 2 incidents in this part of the story. Well, 3 if you count that nightmare fuel from the end of the last volume that I still do not fully understand. Oh, and just a reminder, I will be telling things ever so slightly out of order, as I think the manga adaptation does give a little bit too much away too early. And with that, I bring you the second and final video in our series on Satougashi no Dangan wa Uchinukenai, aka Candy Bullets Cannot Penetrate Anything, aka a lollipop or a bullet. Enjoy. We start out with Nagisa continuing to try and puzzle out what exactly is going on with Mokuzu after their discovery of the murdered and dismembered dog. Was it really her father like she claimed? Or does her eccentric behavior and general disconnection from reality perhaps hide a darker nature? While Nagisa is trying to resist being pulled away from her true bullet nature by Mokuzu's candy, and if that sentence sounded like gibberish to you, I would strongly recommend rewatching part 1. She cannot help but be utterly stymied. Oh right, this will come and go throughout volume 2, but we'll be cutting back to Nagisa and her brother walking up in the mountains, which does, among other things, imply that he did eventually somehow manage to leave the house. And yes, these little interludes will make a lot of sense later on, but we won't be looking at them over much. This time though, the discussion is really interesting, as we find out about Stockholm Syndrome, a real but little understood psychological phenomenon first named in the 1970s after a hostage situation at a bank in Sweden that saw the hostages become bizarrely attached to, even affectionate towards the hostage takers. Essentially, this syndrome sees captives begin to sympathize with or even develop an emotional bond with their captors, one that can persist even after being rescued, at times requiring actual deprogramming. and this can be so intense that former captives will vehemently defend and even try to protect said captors. Likely the most notorious and highly referred to case is that of Patty Hearst, a celebrity who was taken captive by the SLA, a now mostly forgotten hard-left anti-capitalist group of militants that did some frankly supervillain level shit, some of which makes a simple kidnapping look like building a puppy hospital. Seriously, these guys were basically Hydra by way of bread tube, even though, in my opinion, Hearst is more of a case of deliberate brainwashing than Stockholm Syndrome. Anyways, where was I? Oh right, Nagisa realizes that somehow this might apply to Mokuzu, although, as we will see later, mild spoilers, she might honestly be talking about herself too. Later, we see her feeding the rabbits at their school, and we get a few more insights into Nagisa's personality and what might have turned her into such a hardened, cynical person. After the death of her father, her brother's retreat from the outside world, and her family being plunged into poverty, she began to feel sorry for herself, and the awareness of this self-pity led her to want to become an adult as soon as possible and to join the SDF. Mokuzu shows up and asks her if she likes looking after the rabbits, but Nagisa hedges. She is evidently still wary around the girl, unsure of the truth of what happened to the dog exactly. And while she is civil, even slightly friendly, she also keeps her distance, which is understandable. Nagisa's bullet realism was deeply shaken, both by her emerging friendship with someone who truly is her polar opposite, as well as their night walk up the mountain, her gradual relaxation, and the terrible incident that immediately followed. As it might, to her, have seemed like she was punished for relaxing, it probably just seemed simpler to sever contact then and there. Likely sensing this, Mokuzu becomes extremely sad. Yeah, I have no idea why, but this panel actually hits pretty hard. And yes, here's a dead cicada representing summer drawing to a close. Is this a Higurashi nod? Or is this more of an allegory to the brief period of peace, dead dogs accepted, coming to an end? Who knows? Sure enough, Mokuzu begins to warn Nagisa that the storm she mentioned before, representing the deadline for her making a real friend perhaps, is now approaching. Yeah, that's not ominous at all. She actually gives a date this time, which is very odd in hindsight, October the 3rd, and she says that the storm will devastate boats and bring all of the mermaids in, presumably to take her away with them. Of course, her father having died at sea, Nagisa snaps at her, but immediately feels bad and realizes that despite her again trying to push this strange, fey girl away, she cannot help but acknowledge that she is starting to develop feelings of some sort for Mokuzu, and by way of making her own behavior up to her, asks if she wants to help look after the rabbits together. Yeah, Nagisa, she seems happy, but remember how she reacted to the rabbits previously, talking about how they are the enemies of mermaids. Maybe this wasn't the best idea. Regardless, the two do mend fences and begin growing closer again, with Nagisa telling Mokuzu that her brother figured out her whole turning to foam trick, which she admits he was actually correct on. It was, allegedly, simple misdirection involving the door and the loud chime, and the two share a laugh. But Mokuzu then says that next time she'll actually do it. She will turn to sea foam and vanish. This annoys Nagisa a little bit and sours the mood slightly, and the two part with the tension of something truly dreadful looming over the horizon. The storm is coming. The next day, Nagisa turns up to feed the rabbits and is surprised to find Kanajima, the boy who had a crush on Mokuzu, standing near the open hutch. Only, there's something on his shoes. Nagisa asks him what the hell is going on, only then realizing that he's in shock, repeating, "There's no head," over and over again. And he, oh what the hell, holds up a bloody, headless carcass of a rabbit. Nagisa opens the hutch, looks in, and I will spare you the full panel, but it is just a bloody mess in there. Mutilated rabbits and gore everywhere. At the principal's office, Kanajima just keeps repeating that one of them had no head. Kids being kids, this is naturally the gossip of the day, with most people suspecting the still traumatized Kanajima, but he suddenly begins to snap out of his funk and loudly accuses Mokuzu, saying that while she's usually late to school, today she showed up early. She doesn't appear to be fazed at all, instead responding with a cold amusement, revealing that while she knew the combination to the lock, which surprisingly was his birthday, 527, the 27th of May, meaning that not only might he have in fact been able to access the hutch himself, but that Nagisa might have a mild crush on him. And she continues, just slashing away, revealing a very different side of her. Whip-smart, highly insightful, and unbelievably cruel, saying that there is plenty of evidence that he is the culprit, and then obliquely threatens to bring the police into it, and just keeps going from there, revealing that she has him pretty well figured out, and this eventually results in him snapping and, not to put too fine a point on it, lays into Mokuzu, punching her repeatedly to make her stop. Nagisa rushes in to pull him off, comforting the dazed and bloody girl as Kanajima comes to his senses, and he then bursts into tears as the teacher escorts him away. Mokuzu, slowly coming to, tells Nagisa that it wasn't her. It was Kanajima that killed the rabbits. Nagisa, however, is not an idiot. She noticed that Mokuzu was just taking the punches, not making any effort to defend herself, and is troubled, likely remembering the dead dog that Mokuzu desperately blamed on her father after buying a huge machete. What the hell is going on here? Regardless, Nagisa grabs Kanajima's and Mokuzu's bags, the latter having been taken to the principal, I assume, and the former being sent to the nurse. Okay, so this all might need a little bit of explanation. Why did no one intervene to pull Kanajima off Mokuzu? And why wasn't the teacher involved here? So, while there is some, more than just some bullying in schools out in the country, actual physical altercations are pretty rare outside of remedial schools or the occasional dump schools for no-hopers, most often given the euphemism of agricultural school. City schools can obviously be a little bit different. Fights, however, when they do occur, are handled uniquely. I will talk more about this when we get further into Gantz or when I do that Bibliomania deep dive that you all seem to want. But a lot of Japanese teachers and schools employ what tends to be referred to as mimamori, which doesn't translate amazingly well. Wait and see is probably the closest in English, but it doesn't work here. It's more like a portmanteau of observe and protect. And this system of mimamori was what replaced the far more draconian education system with the gradual outlawing of corporal punishment in the 90s. Basically, kids are left to their own devices as so far as socialization goes. If there is a fight, the teacher is to stand back and just make sure it doesn't go too far and that nobody gets seriously hurt. In cases where a fight does occur, it's likely that any punishment meted out will be both participants instructed to do a shared chore together. If you've read My Hero Academia, yeah, that's what that was about. Bullying, however, is a bit different. And this is where the situation gets very complicated. Again, I will talk more about this in more depth in another video. But while it's all too easy to blame teachers for the intense and often psychotic bullying that goes on in Japanese schools, a big problem is that Mimamori conflicts directly with several mandates handed down from the government. Fighting is fine, but beating someone up as a part of bullying is not. And I would suspect that in the case of this sort of unprovoked assaults, especially where a boy beats the stuffing out of a girl, even when provoked, this would more likely be treated as an incident of bullying than a simple fight, meaning that Kanejima would be likely not to wind up at a reform school for a few months, and his family forced to pay a stupid amount of money to Mokuzu's. Regardless, walking down the corridor, Nagisa mulls all of this over. Whatever happened to the shy and sweet-tempered Kanejima to turn him into a raging berserker like that? Not to mention Mokuzu's bizarre actions. Then, she suddenly realizes that she can smell something a little bit strange and not entirely pleasant. She thinks that it might be coming from Kanejima's bag, which she opens but finds nothing. Then she checks Mokuzu's bag. Holy crap! The head of a rabbit stares back at her with lifeless eyes, and only then does she realize that Mokuzu's bag is wet with blood. However, rather than freaking out, Nagisa goes to the nurse's office and puts a letter under the dozing Mokuzu's pillow before leaving, revealing that even though she now knows a bit more about Mokuzu's true nature, she still cannot bring herself to hate her. Keep this concept in your minds as we move forwards. There is a definite theme of trauma and toxic relationships in their own way being somehow addictive and bond-forming. Yeah, Stockholm Syndrome might not be in the bullseye, but it is, at the very least, in the inner ring. Yeah, this is one hell of a good story, man. Why do we not have a proper English release of this? Come on, Viz. Come on, 7 Seas. Come on, Yen Press. More people need to read this. Anyway. Sometime later, we learn that, as suspected, Kanejima is being punished pretty harshly for battering Mokuzu. Yeah, had this been treated as a simple blow-off of tension between two students, they'd probably have been assigned cleaning duties together for a month, or, if they have one, working in the school's garden together. However, he received a week's suspension and was expelled from the baseball club. This might actually sound kind of soft, but in Japan, especially for a rural kid, this would mean that his chances of attending anything close to a good high school with a suspension on his record are now 0. And this would exclude him from just a lot of careers. However, being kicked out of the baseball club would sting especially, as clubs in school are where you make a lot of friends in Japan. Hell, lifelong friends in many cases, and are taken extremely seriously by both school and students. Hell, in some of the schools I went to, kids would meet before school, after school, and over the weekends to practice. Straight up losing this on a first offense, yeah, it's not something commonly seen and would really suck, but I guess this was a serious incident. Nagisa, in turn, realizes that she might indeed have some feelings for the guy, but does ask him why he did what he did in regards to beating up Mokuzu. He says that he frankly isn't sure. It just happened. Something about what she was saying and doing caused him to snap and completely lose control. The pair keep talking, and the topic wanders onto the subject of the dead rabbits, with Nagisa saying that it could only have been either him or Mokuzu that slaughtered them. Could Kanejima have foreseeably put the head into Mokuzu's bag to frame her? Who the hell knows? Regardless, the important question is motive. To figure out who did it, they would need to figure out why. Why would someone do such a cruel and wretched thing? Kanejima says something a little scary. Maybe Mokuzu killed the rabbits because, well, Nagisa liked them. Mokuzu is very clearly obsessed with her. He then says something else, this time quite foreboding. He wonders if this is going to stop with the rabbits. And yeah, this is what I mean. Even though there isn't much in the way of scary imagery or gore in this manga, it just cultivates this incredible dread. I know some people describe Made in Abyss as anxiety porn, but Made in Abyss has nothing on this. And yeah, even though she has her suspicions, there is just enough ambiguity that Nagisa can't really do anything, although she may not even want to, due to her own complicated feelings towards Mokuzu. But, well, something really, really bad is going to happen if they don't figure it out. Not just the who, but the why. They split off, and Nagisa finds herself worrying about exactly this. If it was Kanejima that killed the rabbits, what could be the reason? Framing Mokuzu? And what about the dog? A coincidence? On the other hand, if it was Mokuzu and she was trying to isolate Nagisa, this would all make a terrible sort of sense. In one move, she took away pretty much the only two things at school that Nagisa cares about: the rabbits and the boy she likes. And this means that the next target may well be her brother. Oh dear. Bloody hell, man. This is all so terrifying, without a single creepy Nakayama face or much in the way of gore at all. And this sends us into what I think we could safely call Act 3. Let's take a look. As we start heading towards the climax of the story, we see Nagisa at home. This next bit, though, is very Higurashi. Nagisa gets a phone call from Mokuzu that sounds really off, saying that she wants to meet up at the beach immediately. Nagisa cycles out on her brother's bike. Oh right, yeah. In Japan, especially rural Japan, most kids and a lot of adults get around on bikes, while city folks tend to use trains or subways. It's a really interesting cultural divide. Nagisa arrives at the beach and finds Mokuzu standing on, oh hey, this is pretty cool. Do you see that thing she's standing on? Do you know what that is? That, chaps and chapettes, is called a dolos. Artificial concrete tetrapods piled up together to serve as a nearly immovable breakwater. And they were actually invented in my home country, South Africa. However, they were never patented. The story and the dispute over who exactly invented these and why they were never patented is really bloody interesting. Google it if you want to know more. They were often referred to as mulbjena or mad bones in reference to the traditional fortune-telling practices amongst the native Bantu tribes, although this term has been less commonly used these days, as it is, in certain quarters, viewed as rather politically incorrect. Anyways, Nagisa notices that even more of those weird, dirty birthmark-looking patterns are visible on Mokuzu's body, but also realizes that, yeah, there is in fact a mutual attraction here. No use denying it anymore. She finds this strange girl strangely beautiful. To her surprise and fright, Mokuzu suddenly flings herself backwards off the breakwater into the ocean, which causes Nagisa to panic and rush in to save her. But Mokuzu is actually a surprisingly competent swimmer, and the two proceed to have some fun in the ocean, with Mokuzu continuing her mermaid talk, saying that because the seas are all connected, if she wanted to, she could go anywhere. And Nagisa realizing that she no longer really minds indulging Mokuzu, even when it comes to this sort of candy. After a time, they get out of the water, and Nagisa finally asks Mokuzu directly about the marks, as she's realized that they actually most resemble deep and extensive bruises. But Mokuzu tells her that they aren't injuries and are, in fact, damage inflicted on her as a result of oceanic pollution. Nagisa accepts this, to Mokuzu's surprise and happiness, and it's subtle, but this is actually another seismic shift for the down-to-earth, ultra-realistic, even cynical Nagisa. She is choosing to not only indulge the girl, but full-on accept Mokuzu's candy, rather than insisting on the bullet realism of her own beliefs. Anyways, the two part ways, but on her way home, Nagisa finds Mokuzu's handkerchief, and as it's a really expensive brand, she decides to go and return it before heading home for the night. And okay, this is where the story takes a sharp left turn, and we start getting a lot of answers. A lot of answers that aren't just spoilers. And this is where I have to put up a huge content warning. As, yeah, this is a pretty grim story and involves topics that YouTube doesn't much like being discussed. No, I cannot be more specific without giving the game away. So yeah, you have been warned. As Nagisa approaches the estate, she starts hearing faint, strange sounds, thumps, screams, and desperate apologies, and suddenly it all makes sense. The marks were indeed bruises. The answer to the mystery is actually insanely simple. Mokuzu is, and has been, extensively abused by her father, Masachika, for a long period of time. A stunned Nagisa goes home and talks about what happened with her mother. Okay, I am gonna play it safe here and not show too many panels, as Nagisa is in the bath, and while it's not even slightly explicit, you never know with YouTube these days. Regardless, we learn that the living situation over there is sort of common knowledge to the point of being neighborhood gossip. Even more horribly, Mokuzu's odd gait and her limp are due to her being beaten as an infant, which permanently damaged her hip. Yeah, thank you so much for that, manga. Crikey Moses. Oh, and for the same reason, Mokuzu is, in fact, deaf in one ear, which is why she would often seem to be ignoring people, and why she would always stand on Nagisa's left so that she could hear. Holy frigging crap! Sometime later, Mokuzu still hasn't returned to school. Nagisa is unsure of what to do next. She's only 13, so they can't exactly strike off on their own. But while other students gossip about why Mokuzu is staying home and Kanajima's suspension, Nagisa is deeply troubled. One day, she's out and about in the town and sees Mokuzu's father being ogled by the townswoman. Despite herself, Nagisa approaches him and strikes up a conversation, asking when Mokuzu would return to school. He reveals that he has nothing but disdain for his daughter, surprised and somewhat disbelieving that anyone would even want to be her friend. Nagisa rapidly gets angry and confronts him directly about the abuse, and in another very Higurashi beat, he simply leans in close and tells her to prove it, then goes on to threaten to further beggar her mother with a defamation lawsuit if she keeps running her mouth about some non-existent abuse. Yeah, this guy isn't just a bit of a doucher, he is a full-on monster. However, this confrontation does seem to work, oddly enough. The next day, October the 3rd, Mokuzu's foretold day of the storm, she does indeed return to school, seeming a lot happier, and Nagisa begins to grapple with a very difficult realization. By getting taken in by the candy, by Mokuzu's fantasies, she hadn't realized what was going on, or perhaps she had simply allowed herself to be deluded. The idea that this girl was simply an oddball with a strained parental relationship was a much more palatable explanation than what had really been going on. And if Nagisa had been a bit more hard-nosed, she might have clicked sooner. That is a very challenging take, to be honest, and it won't be the only one. And now it is time for the storm. From here on out, the story moves pretty fast, and thus so will I, as we enter the final day of the main narrative. Nagisa has a meeting with her homeroom teacher that afternoon, who, while giving her a hard time about wanting to join the SDF rather than attend high school, he does at least hint that he knows what's going on with Mokuzu, but he cannot do anything. And this causes Nagisa to run away in anger. She finds Mokuzu, who says that the storm will indeed arrive later that day, but does not seem overly concerned. Oh boy, I won't be going through all of this until the end, but the last day is also heavily interspersed with those scenes from the future, showing Nagisa and her brother walking the same mountain path from earlier in the story. This will also make sense later. Kanajima returns to the school to get a bag that he forgot, which prompts probably the most bizarre scene in the entire manga, and one of maybe 3 that I don't really understand. I can't show you much of it for obvious reasons, but he apologizes profusely to Mokuzu, who then, rather than accepting his apology, proceeds to beat the ever-loving hell out of him with a broom handle and implies that the abuse she suffered at the hands of her father, how do I put this delicately, didn't just end with beatings. Bloody hell, manga. However, Nagisa realizes that this, in a massive way, is a breakthrough for Mokuzu. She is no longer stuck in candy fantasy, no longer withdrawn from reality. She is, instead, lashing out with absolute fury at her situation. The two then embrace, finally admitting their feelings, as, sure enough, an immense storm begins to whip outside the windows of the now empty school as evening begins to roll in. Nagisa, not seeing any other options, bites the proverbial bullet. She suggests that the two of them just run away together that very night, to Mokuzu's astonishment, but also joy. Of course, she happily agrees, and, laughing, the two run out into the rain, hand in hand, beginning to make plans. Nagisa heads home, packs a bag, and explains the situation to her brother, who is surprisingly supportive of it. saying that he only wishes her the best and wishes that he could do the same. She then pops back out to meet Mokuzu, who tells Nagisa to give her a minute. She wants to go home and finally confront her father to tell him once and for all to shove it, and then they'll leave. She'll be right back. Mokuzu closes the door, leaving Nagisa marveling at the change that has come over the both of them. Despite the hard road ahead, they are both overjoyed and yet living in reality. Whatever the future holds, they'll be doing it together. Nagisa waits and waits and waits. And as the night rolls on, the storm beats down. Finally, as the sun begins to rise, the door opens and out walks Masachika. He appears utterly distraught and is dragging his luggage behind him. Well done, Mokuzu! Finally stood up to, Masachika has retreated as all bullies do, and the simplest solution has, once again, proved the best. Nagisa enters the estate to try and find her friend, and she wanders around for hours, searching everywhere, but cannot locate her. She begins to get a very eerie feeling, thinking back to all that talk about sea foam and disappearing, as well as the dreadful flashes of foreboding she got last time she was in here. She then enters the bathroom, once again finding the shower running, a strange smell, and a clean machete in the bathtub. Huh? No, wait. You wouldn't do that, would you, story? Of course not. To her horror, a now composed Masachika returns and basically throws her out, saying that he has no idea where his daughter went. Oh, did Mokuzu just do her disappearing act again? As she leaves, Nagisa, on a whim, asks Masachika the hypothetical her brother asked her, the same one that she posed to Mokuzu on the mountain. A recent widow murders her child after meeting a man at her husband's funeral. Why did she do it? Masachika pauses, considers this, and then, to Nagisa's horror, answers correctly. The woman met the man at a funeral. So, if she created another funeral, maybe she would be able to see him again. She then realizes that Masachika is crying again and asks him what the hell happened to Mokuzu. He responds that she's turned into sea foam. The hell? Believing that her friend might have been, straight up murdered by her father after she confronted him and told him that she was leaving, she dashes home, but neither her teacher nor her mother take her seriously. Maybe Mokuzu just left under her own power, choosing for some reason to strike off alone. But no, that doesn't sound right either. Then what? Where was she? A captive at home? But Nagisa searched the house from top to bottom while Masachika was out. Some kind of secret room, maybe? Unsure of what to do next, Nagisa talks the matter over with her brother, and they put the final terrible piece of the puzzle together. The suitcase? Oh crap. He immediately tells her that they are going up the mountain right now, despite him being visibly distraught at having to face his agoraphobia, to the extent that he begins to vomit repeatedly. And we then realize that their walk up the mountain is what we have been seeing in all of those brief intermissions throughout the story. Finally, they reach the top, and her brother tells her to wait here. He wants to go and see something. She's hopeful, but then he returns, completely blank-faced, and tells her that they need to go home right this minute. Nagisa, however, pushes past him and into the same clearing where they found the dog last time, and is suddenly paralyzed with wide-eyed, screaming horror. We actually do not get a good look at what she sees, perhaps fortunately, although the 2 glimpses we do get are just enough to allow us to imagine the absolute ruin that Nagisa is exposed to. After Mokuzu came home and finally stood up to her father, telling him that she was going and that he couldn't stop her, Masachika killed her with the machete in a fit of rage, and then he proceeded to dismember her and chop her into pieces, after which he cleaned the machete, put the pieces of his daughter into a suitcase, and, in pitch black remorse, took her to the top of the mountain, piled her remains up, and, much like with the dog, left a note, this time simply reading, "Goodbye, Mokuzu." Holy frigging crap. And this is where we start getting to the point of the story where we have to start analyzing things. I'll be doing this in 2 portions. First, we'll be taking a look at the epilogue, and then we'll be doing a cultural analysis as to where this story fits in the context of turn of the millennium Japan. First up, the final parts of the manga, serving as a sort of epilogue / afterword, are somewhat fragmented. We get a fuller picture of what exactly was going on, and also start to get an idea of what, perhaps, the author might be alluding to with this story. See, we learn that the homeroom teacher was about to do something. The neighbors were about to do something. Everyone was about to do something, but nobody did anything. Mostly what they did was note their concerns loudly, saying, "Wow, this situation is really unfortunate. Someone should really do something," and take that as the end of their responsibility. Because at the end of the day, there was no mystery here. There were no mermaids. There was no candy. All there was were bullets, and people just ignored them. Rather than being moral actors, they went, "Oh, she's so weird and quirky," or "Oh, that poor girl," and let Mokuzu, who had long ago collapsed psychologically, drag them into a convenient fantasy world. It's interesting, and frankly really challenging, to see an author come down on the side of cynicism as opposed to hopefulness. But in situations like this, well, I kind of do see her point. Even Nagisa herself allowed Mokuzu to draw her in, to the extent that she let Mokuzu go home to confront a man that she knew might be dangerous, rather than just leaving under the naive impression that they were going to strike out on their own and nothing could go wrong. We get more of this in the form of a lengthy epilogue, where we see everyone ruminating on what could have been done, and that Masachika's true nature was an open secret. He basically said as much in his songs, and yet some people even begin to romanticize him further, seeing him not as a horrible murderer, but as a tragic hero. Nagisa's brother, in turn, left his candy hikikomori world, and does, in fact, wind up joining the SDF, allegedly thriving. Nagisa is left to an uncertain fate. The last we see of her is her walking the paths of her small town, down along the beach, and as she walks, she keeps finding Mokuzu's water bottles. Damn, man. Our final word is a reiteration of the title of the manga, now given its meaning as a warning. Candy bullets cannot pierce anything. Hope, fantasy, and pretty words may have their place somewhere, but are not especially useful when hard realities come calling. Just wow. And with that, it's time to get into the deeper analysis portion of the text. And this is going to wind up being a lot more serious than my content usually is. So, if you want to head off and call it a day, rather than endure yet more heavy stuff, I totally understand. For everyone else, okay, so before we get into the cultural analysis, which is where things are going to get really serious, I actually do want to talk about the story overall, both in terms of the stuff I think I understand, and the questions that I have remaining. Keep in mind that visuals are going to be a bit sparse for this section as, we've got some serious topics coming, and these are a bit too serious for my usual silly asides. So, first up, there are a lot of questions that do, probably deliberately, remain unanswered here. I am genuinely curious as to your own takes. From my perspective, Mokuzu had a form of Stockholm Syndrome. She desperately loved her father, despite his constant mistreatment, and this made her extremely possessive over him. But at the same time, extensive abuse had resulted in her disassociating. What's more interesting is, as is quite common with abuse victims, Mokuzu was incredibly perceptive in terms of the vulnerabilities of others, and thus she was able to manipulate Nagisa and Kanejima, the latter of whom became something of a stand-in for her father, allowing her to lash out. Then it gets a bit more ambiguous. Masachika, to my mind, is probably the one that killed the dog, which is why the notes on the dog and Mokuzu's body were so similar. There is an outside chance that Mokuzu might have manipulated the situation to encourage the night walk with Nagisa so that she would find the carcass and maybe understand the reality of Mokuzu's situation a bit better. The rabbits, I'm still not sure of. I suspect that Mokuzu is the one that killed them and endeavored to frame Kanejima in order to have Nagisa to herself. The part that I don't understand is how Mokuzu accurately predicted the storm, which was a metaphor for her own impending death and dismemberment at the hands of her father. Now, as to the cultural side of things, abuse and bullying are huge cultural problems in modern Japan, and despite endless national or prefectural mandates, committees, campaigns, TV ads, school assemblies, tip lines, anonymized forms, support associations, and even changes to the laws on the books, these remain very difficult for Japan to handle. Bullying, as I've said, we'll talk about this more when we get further into Gantz, or if I give in and do that Jujutsu Kaisen deep dive you all seem to want. And I will admit, after reading the bloody thing at last, I am actually tempted to give you. However, domestic violence, be it child abuse or spousal abuse, is even more complicated. See, from my understanding, until a few decades ago, it wasn't even strictly illegal, being relegated to that awkward Japanese no man's land of familial privacy, where the heads of the family would be expected to handle any sort of impropriety within said family, leaving outside authorities with minimal investigative power. It actually wasn't until the late 90s that Japan even begun to sign treaties in regards to acknowledging the basic human rights of children and that more should be done to protect them. This did, over time, result in the outlawing of the rampant and often excessive use of corporal punishment in schools, and also to allow police to pierce the veil of the family to investigate abuse more aggressively. However, well, let's just say that much like with hobbits, change in Japan comes slowly, if at all. And even today, while there is at least some enforcement of laws and awareness of domestic violence resources, particularly in the bigger cities, this is mostly targeted at intimate partner violence, and much less so when it comes to violence directed towards children. it remains a very thorny issue, especially out in the country, where, in the minds of a lot of people, it will always likely be 1940, a time where the family unit and parental authority remained sacrosanct. And this seems to be what the story is touching on, much as a particularly notorious Higurashi arc from that era, and I actually anticipate referring back to this video when I do that one. You see, when this kind of thing happens, it's not exactly a secret. Everyone in the neighborhood or even the town knows. It is gossiped about widely, with everyone saying how awful it is, those poor kids, that poor woman, someone should really do something. But of course, nobody does. And it's not strictly their faults, because even when they do, it frequently becomes more complicated. The victim will often refuse to cooperate, and without a direct complaint, the social workers or police are unwilling or even unable to investigate. Again, family privacy is still a big deal. Beyond this, it might actually mean reprisals or shame attaching to the reporter for maybe making the situation worse, or even if the culprit were to be arrested or separated, his or her relatives could wind up hassling the person that made the initial report forever, as, well, this sort of thing never stays anonymous. Secondly, even when a complaint is made and an investigation begins, what often happens is that the abuser simply moves to another prefecture or another town and straight up takes the victim with them. And this is enough for everyone to dust their hands and declare mission accomplished. Without going into too many details, I have seen this happen firsthand, and I suspect that, once again, this is what the manga was alluding to with their move from the city to the country. Thirdly, Japan is an intensely collectivist country in ways that can be difficult to easily explain, particularly as far as guilt goes. You see, when something like this happens, responsibility tends to be spread around with a big shovel, with some attached to basically everyone, even peripherally involved. I know that, in my time in Japan as a teacher, I saw this happen a handful of times. The one time child abuse was reported to the police successfully by the school. This resulted in the school's reputation suffering terribly. After all, they should have somehow stopped it from happening at the beginning. And even if they couldn't, well, there was an offense, now there must be punishment. And that means we could all move on and forget that it ever happened. And yeah, this resulted in the school, and I guess the entire neighborhood, being punished via the cancellation of that year's school festival, which, if you've ever watched an anime or read a manga about high school, you would know what a huge deal that is. And yeah, it's a bit of a downer note to go out on, but this story is very much an angry as hell socio-cultural critique of this issue within small-town Japan circa the early 2000s, and it would have been remiss of me to cover it without delving a bit further in. And that is that. What a story, though. See what I mean? I want to bring this one over officially so badly, but I cannot even find a Japanese copy up for sale anywhere right now that isn't going to hose me on shipping. I cannot recommend it enough. And while it doesn't have a ton of gore or nastiness, this one haunted me for weeks, and does so every time I read it, and yet, whenever I do, I spot another bit of clever foreshadowing or potential allegory here and there. If you can, track this one down and read it for yourself. Before we finish for the day, I just want to say, as always, a massive and heartfelt thanks to my amazing patrons, without whom this channel would long ago have ceased to exist. Cheddar, Crazy, Question Man 6, Starwin Marwin, Hunting for R2D2, Kel Core, Opinion Custard, Piece of Yeast, Ranger Danger, Rose Montgomery, Wargle, The Empress, Inukia Koji, Cheshire Quill, Endymion, Aaron Arnold, Jake, Just Zero, Lance Goebel, Lucian, Rafferty, Simone, Jake Ramsey, and Squid. I also want to give a very special thanks to our Owlbard patrons, Jathis and Polite Crow. That is so generous, I don't even know what to say. If you want to help us out by supporting the channel, please head on over to our Patreon. You will also earn early videos, exclusive content, Discord perks, including a patrons only channel, as well as some other fun stuff, and more. If you want to support us further or commission some art from the amazingly talented Mrs. Owl, you could hit her up on our Discord or her business email. All links, as always, are in the description. Otherwise, take care all, and cheers. I will see you next time. This is the Owl, signing off.